Good morning and thank you for being here. My name is Hilda Anderson-Pyrz. I'm a proud Cree woman from Otipemisiwak Cree Nation, and I'm the president of the National Family and Survivor Circle, Inc. I stand here today not only as a leader, but as an Indigenous woman alongside powerful women and respected leaders who have dedicated themselves to protecting the right to life, safety, and human security for Indigenous women, girls, and to us LGBTQIA+ people. We stand with them, with families impacted by missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and with survivors of gender and race-based violence. We are here because the truth is already known. This ongoing genocide is a human rights crisis. Despite repeated commitments to fully implement the calls for justice, recent actions point to a growing gap between stated priorities and concrete measures. When we examine the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, it's clear that this issue has persisted for decades. Despite various programs and resources aimed at addressing it, we continue to see a troubling pattern of ongoing, inequitable, and inconsistent funding cycles. In March, crucial funding to some Indigenous organizations ended with no official notification of renewal. For the National Family and Survivor Circle, that was $840,000 in annual funding that allows us to operate, and to date we haven't received an official commitment. This lack of sustained support is a significant barrier to making real progress in combating this crisis. Today, our right to life is threatened by the lack of political will, and it will remain so unless the government enacts the 231 calls for justice. But 7 years later, after they were created, only 2 have been fully implemented. Prevention means investing in Indigenous solutions, safe housing, community-based supports, culturally grounded services that stop violence before it happens. Human security means Indigenous women, girls, and to us LGBTQIA+ people are safe in every sense, physically, socially, economically, and culturally. It means Indigenous women, families, survivors, and communities are at the center of every decision and every major project that impacts their lives. This requires long-term, sustainable, and equitable funding that matches the scale of the crisis. We have seen short-term funding decisions that undermine the very organizations working to prevent violence and support families and survivors. The cost of this violence is measured in lives lost, families shattered, and hundreds of millions of dollars every year. Canada benefits when Indigenous women, girls, and to us LGBTQIA+ people are safe. What is needed now is political will. We are calling on the government to fully implement the 231 calls for justice with long-term, sustainable, equitable funding and Indigenous women's leadership at every level of decision-making. Our lives are not optional, our safety is not optional, and accountability is not optional. This is a turning point. If our voices aren't at the table, then as the Prime Minister so often says, we are on the menu. There is a path forward and requires all of us the will to act and the determination to end this crisis. Thank you.
Sego, Melanie Morrison, Yujets. Good morning, my name is Melanie Morrison. I am a Mohawk from the community of Giganawenimaanaanig, Quebec. I am here. I'm the sister of Tiffany Morrison. My sister was 24 years old when she went missing June 18th, 2006. 4 years later, her remains were found in a wooded area less than a kilometer from her home. And two decades later, I'm still living the reality that her killer has never been caught. Justice has not been found. Nobody's been held accountable, and we're still waiting for justice. When there are no answers, the trauma does not end. It follows you every day. It lives in your family, in your community. It changes how you see the world. and how safe you feel in it. For nearly 20 years, I have carried with me as I worked to protect Indigenous women and girls, not just in my community, but nationally, internationally, including the United Nations. I do this work not only as a leader, but as a sister who knows what it means to keep searching for justice that has not come. We have made progress. We have changed how investigations are handled. We have helped build better supports for families so that they are not left alone the way mine was. The organizations standing here today are lifelines. They support people and communities impacted by the ongoing genocide, and they hold governments accountable. Governments have a legal obligation that are grounded in human and Indigenous rights law to fully implement the 231 calls for justice, which are not optional. If this work is not supported, if organizations are not sustained, then we are turning our backs on families and survivors who are still searching, still grieving, still living with unanswered loss. My sister's story is not unique, but it should be. The work these organizations do, the work that I do, is for my daughters, and it's for my community. It is to ensure that they grow up in a world where they don't have to face the threats that I did. The threats that killed their auntie. But they can't live in the future unless these organizations are empowered to continue their essential work holding governments accountable to its legal mandate to implement the calls for justice. We need these organizations to remind those in government, decision makers, public servants, and Canadians of the actions they need to take to ensure the safety of our communities. Safety for Indigenous women, girls, and to us LGBTQIA+ people. My sister's death is a tragedy, but it's a pain that too many families have felt needlessly. We can solve this crisis, but we cannot do it without Indigenous women and families leading the charge. We must be at the table. This government must prioritize our work. This starts with funding that shows this is a priority. Nyawa, thank you.
Indigenous Good morning. My name is Josie Nepinak, and I am President for the Native Women's Association of Canada. We are deeply disappointed to see critical funding reduced or allowed to sunset, while violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA+ people continues at an alarming rate. The calls for justice were not recommendations. They are legal imperatives. The calls outline the actions required to address what has been recognized as an ongoing genocide. Yet today, we see a pattern where communities commitments are made but not sustained, and where Indigenous women's voices are often excluded from decisions that directly impact our lives. At the Native Women's Association of Canada, we know that the solutions already exist. Indigenous women in all of their diversities are already leading this critical work in our communities and every day, but leadership without stable funding and long-term funding cannot succeed. Sunsetting undermines progress, disrupts essential services, and places lives at risk. It sends a message that this work is temporary, while in reality, the need has never been more urgent. We are calling on the federal government to uphold its moral and legal obligations by ensuring sustained, equitable funding for Indigenous women's organizations, and by meaningfully including us in the implementation of the 231 calls for justice. Ending this violence requires more than words. It requires action, accountability, and leadership. I also want to add that there is a war on Indigenous women in this country, and this war has happened since contact, and that war has not ended. And it's time to end that war, to create safety, and collectively we must save lives. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Lisa Pigeau. As Les Femmes Michif Otipemisiwak, our mandate comes from the voices and day-to-day realities of Métis women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA+ people across the Métis motherland. Our role is to carry those experiences into policy and advocacy, ensuring decisions reflect the strength, risk, and realities our people face. There have been no new federal funding announcements and no firm commitments to continued support for missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA+ folks beyond March 31st, 2026. That uncertainty is real, but it doesn't change our focus. We remain focused on the conditions shaping the lives of Métis women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA+ people, on advancing policy changes needed to keep them safe. This includes continuing to seek support to build a Métis-specific MMIWG 2S+ database. LFMO fully supports the national implementation of a redress alert. When someone goes missing, the response must be immediate, coordinated, and centered on families and community. Our safety cannot be treated as a pilot project. We work in allyship with the National Family and Survivors Circle to advocate for sustainable, equitable funding. Families and survivors carry the ongoing impacts of the crisis every day, and their voices must remain at the center of decision-making and accountability processes. Ongoing funding gaps continue to limit the ability to support them, to walk alongside them, and to ensure their experiences continue to shape the work moving forward. The 231 calls for justice and Les Femmes Michif Otipemisiwak's 62 calls for Miskotaha already set out what needs to happen. What is missing is full and concurrent implementation. Without it, Métis women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA+ people remain at risk. For us, this work is about safety, accountability, transparency, and follow-through. It is about ensuring oversight mechanisms are in place to ensure funding is equitable and sustainable and directed to address the 231 calls. And it's about making sure that commitments that have been made lead to real change in people's lives. Until families can see and feel that change, there is more to do.
Good morning. My name is Sandra DeLaronde, and I represent Giganawenimaanaanig, which is formerly the MMIWG Implementation Committee in Manitoba. I'm humbled to be in the company of such distinguished matriarchs who have spent the better part of their lives working for the betterment of the people, particularly for Indigenous women, girls, and gender-diverse relatives. I also find it very painful to be here, knowing that there has been no substantive action on the calls to justice as outlined in the final report of the National Inquiry into MMIWG 2S+ relatives, and the loss of lives of our relatives have exponentially increased since the release of this report. In Manitoba alone, there have been 121 murders since the release of the report. Canada has recognized the facts of this report, and importantly, that we are living in an ongoing genocide. In 2023, Parliament recognized violence against Indigenous women and girls as a national emergency. From the recognition of this national emergency to today, there have been 53 recorded homicides in Manitoba alone. The result of recognizing this national emergency was the federal government examined the calls to justice 1.7 and 1.10, of which no action has been taken to be implemented. Further, Giganawenimaanaanig was tasked with determining the parameters of the implementation of a red dress alert system. This report was presented on November 24th, 2025, and since then, there have been 5 recorded homicides in Manitoba alone. We are indeed living in a crisis, and action must be taken now. We continue to see the lack of impact of action on a daily basis. This is what Canadian genocide looks like, and we continue to see the impact of systemic genocide, while at the same time, government continues to perpetuate the harms by removing resources to support the safety, security, and well-being of Indigenous women and their families, wherever they live in this great country of ours, this country we call home. It is unconscionable that measures that are community-centered, prevention-focused, culturally competent and trauma-informed, and meant to save lives are gutted to fund the military complex, which, in the words of Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew, not a single Canadian should ever be put in harm's way to defend Donald Trump's foolish Iranian war. Yet, Indigenous women, girls, and gender-diverse relatives are put in harm's way every day by the actions of this government. Miigwech.
Thank you so much, everyone. I was very honored to be invited by Indigenous matriarchs, leaders in our community, to show my support in their calls for justice. When the budget was released, I was shocked to find out that Prime Minister Carney is cutting $7 billion between Indigenous Services Canada and Crown Indigenous Relations. They provided $0 to deal with the ongoing genocide of MMIWG 2S LGBTQIA+. This is abhorrent. This is callous. This is callous because the very Liberal government that has stripped organizations of life-sustaining funding has now committed $13 billion on military spending. Who is paying for it? Indigenous women across this country, Indigenous women, girls, 2S LGBTQIA+, are not safe. In fact, rates of violence are increasing. And what is the Prime Minister doing? He is turning a blind eye on this violence. You know, the Prime Minister talks a lot about projects of national interest. What is in the national interest are the lives, safety, security, and dignity, not in the national interest of Indigenous women and girls 2S LGBTQIA+. Is the Prime Minister okay having Indigenous women 2S LGBTQIA+ family members and organization coming to Parliament begging time and time again to see our humanity? Is he okay with that? Well, clearly, with his behavior the other day, laughing at a woman from Grassy Narrows who is suffering from mercury poisoning, having to beg for an apology, is an example of how this Prime Minister has turned his back on Indigenous peoples, particularly Indigenous women and girls 2S LGBTQIA+. And what does that look like? It looks like rates of violence increasing. It looks like me representing a riding in this country that was recognized by the former Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations as ground zero of MMIWG. It looks like me working with some of the organizations on stage to try and get funding for evacuees who have been left from Pimichikimak without assistance in the riding of Winnipeg Centre, to make sure that particularly women, girls, 2S, LGBTQIA plus evacuees currently residing in Winnipeg Centre, away from community because of a failure of this government to deal with hydro, to make sure they're safe from sex trafficking, sexual exploitation. It looks like requests for us to work again with zero response from the minister. This government has turned a blind eye on this crisis. We are of national interest. And it's time that the Liberal government and Prime Minister Carney stops not leaving us out at the table and gets us involved in the discussions. We are valuable, we are loved, we are beautiful, and their ignorance in terms of ignoring this ongoing violence and genocide is absolutely abhorrent. Thank you.
Questions in the room? Good morning, Olivia Spanovich with CBC News. I just have a question of clarification. I'd like to get your response to this just to clear this up. Is it true that you are receiving 6 months of additional funding from the federal government in the interim as you sort out a long-term solution? And how much funding are you receiving? Is it $400,000? And what is the status of long-term discussions with the federal government about continuing this fund going forward?
Well, we have not received any confirmation of ongoing funding, like an official confirmation. And the discussions are ongoing, but we're like in April of 2026, the next fiscal year. Our funding ended March 31st, 2026, and we're still without funding.
You haven't received any funding, like today you don't have any funding coming through, okay? And how is that impacting, can you just give us a sense of how that's impacting the work you do, women across the country?
It really impacts our organizational structure to be able to, plan, carry out our strategic plan, to be able to hire and retain staff, to be able to attend meetings, for our advocacy, to try to influence policy legislation. Like, it deeply impacts our work if we don't have a commitment of long-term sustainable funding. And that's the key here, is that, Indigenous women's lives are treated like projects, right? Why has the government not committed equitable funding, to Indigenous women's organizations and long-term sustainable funding? Why do we constantly have to go to government and beg for funding? It clearly demonstrates that they're not taking this crisis as seriously as they should, and they need to do sustainable, equitable investments, to end this ongoing genocide.
I just have a question for you, Mrs. Gazan, please. Is that possible in French? Do you prefer in English?
English, I
English,
think.
okay.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm
practicing.
Okay, perfect. Just one question about the fact that you have a new leader, and under the impulse of this new leader, how can the NDP help or influence the government to answer the current crisis?
Well, I have to say I'm very happy with the election of our new leader. He's been very clear on this issue, particularly pertaining to man camps, calling out the violence against Indigenous women and girls around resource extraction. In fact, he made that a priority in his leadership race, which is why I endorsed him. But I want to be really clear. I'm here supporting and lifting up the voices of Indigenous women today. We need to use our platforms as leaders to lift up the voices of folks on the ground. That's what I'm here to do today. That's something that our new leader is committed to. He comes from the grassroots. He understands that places of power often exclude the voices that are most impacted. That includes Indigenous women and girls. It's fine time that we have a leader that's really dedicated to lifting up voices that are excluded. And like today, I'm very proud to have a leader that will continue to demonstrate that through how we proceed forward.
Thank you.
I actually have a question for you, Hilda.
For who?
For you.
Okay.
Yeah, so you had mentioned at the beginning that the $140,000 that you had was ending.
840?
840, thank you. 840,000 had ended without any notice. Obviously, you know, there was, it was listed in the budget, you know, which programs were sunsetting. Did you have any conversations with the federal government, or was it simply just no notice at all, no?
Well, you know, we always have ongoing conversations with the federal government because we're always fighting for the inherent and human rights of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people, and we're always advocating for equitable, long-term, sustainable funding. So these conversations have been ongoing for decades.
And how much money are you looking for in terms of sustained?
Well, I'm looking for long-term equitable funding, you know, that will really support the National Family and Survivor Circle and other Indigenous women-led organizations to be equitable partners in fighting this ongoing crisis and ending it.
Do you have a number?
I don't have a number because when you're looking at the cost of human life, we can't place a number on that. Thank you.
Karen Blues, APTN. I was also just curious about the funding. I wasn't sure if I understood if it was core funding or program funding. I'd looked online and I saw that there were some grants that were still continuing to 2029. So could you just kind of lay it out for me?
Well, those are like anytime you're an Indigenous organization, right, you receive some core funding and then you continuously have to chase funding to be able to fully develop, you know, and carry out the work that you envision, you know, by the voices of families and survivors and Indigenous women, girls, and to us who are directing you. So it's challenging, you know, because you're often a very small team and you're looking at continuously chasing and competing for resources, and it's really hard to continuously do that, and you're bogged down by chasing funding, doing multiple reports, you know, and when you're looking at like Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people, why are we not valued enough, you know, to have core funding invested to be able to build those pathways for prevention, healing, wellness, dignity, and justice?
Yeah, it seemed that there was core funding, and some of that seems to be ending, and there's a little bit continuing. But then there was also funding for at least 2 programs.
Well, those are, like I said, those are funding that we chase, like to do other stuff in addition to our mandate, because we want to be able to carry out additional work, because there's not enough resources or not enough organizations to be able to support this ongoing genocide. So we continuously chase funding to be able to do more and to build capacity, not only within our organization, but so that impact is felt on the ground by Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people and families and survivors. So it's continuously chasing and begging for money. So thank you.
Is it programs that are going to end, or is it like layoffs that are going to happen? I guess I'm just trying to get...
Well, it's like programs end, right? And of course, layoffs happen when programs end, right? You can't, you know, and even to retain and recruit staff when you don't have long-term core funding is very difficult, you know, because not a lot of people want to take that risk to, you know, come on. If we're guaranteed 6 months of funding, how are you going to be able to recruit someone and retain staff, you know, to be able to support the organization to carry out this work? It becomes very, very difficult and very challenging, you know, to ensure that we have the capacity and the infrastructure for success. Thank you.
Can I just add to that? I think it's important to note that, I mean, we're talking about cutbacks to Indigenous Services Canada and Crown Indigenous relationships. It's no secret that Indigenous peoples across this Turtle Island were already grossly underfunded. The fact that we even have to be having this discussion with a government who has recognized this crisis as an ongoing genocide. They accepted the report. A chapter in the report proved how what is happening to Indigenous women and girls, to us LGBTQIA+, is an ongoing genocide. So the fact that we have to be here today, asking for money to deal with a recognized genocide is absolutely violent and unacceptable. That's number one. Number two, let's not forget, Carney's whole plan for Canada is based around Indigenous lands, territories, and resources. Once again, on the backs of Indigenous peoples. Where's the safety plans for Indigenous women in those circumstances? where we know there's increased rates of violence between resource extraction and increased violence against Indigenous women and girls, no plan. And where are the voices of Indigenous women in even that example? Nowhere, not invited to the table. This is unacceptable. This is unacceptable that it's been 7 years since the release of the final report, and here we are again today begging for money so that we can live. We have a charter, we have Article 7, that protects our right to live in dignity and security. The government needs to stop violating our charter rights, and the government needs to provide sustainable funding now. We shouldn't be having discussions about cutbacks. In fact, if the government can find $13 billion to fund military, he certainly can find money to adequately fund Indigenous peoples, including Indigenous women and women's organizations, so that we can live in safety. That's not too much to ask. We're not asking for anything special, just not to have our lives placed at risk every day. You would think that would be of national interest to the Prime Minister. It is not. So we are calling on the Prime Minister to recognize this as a first priority and as of a national interest. Thank you.
I just want to add the easiest way to understand this is that as a domestically violent relationship, you know, if we are good and, you know, support government, then we get funding. If we question government, funding is removed, you know, so, and that's what happens in domestic violent relationships. So we're asking Canada, you know, to recognize us as full partners and remove their, you know, proclivity towards domestic violence towards Indigenous women and girls.
Hey, Alessia Pescini with the Canadian Press. I'm wondering if any of you can speak about what impact this will have on families and on women on the ground if this funding isn't renewed.
The cutting in funding will stop the advancement of the 231 calls to justice. The women behind me are pushing the government to live up to their responsibility, which is going to protect our women and our girls and 2S LGBTQIA plus people moving forward. 7 years ago, I was here and I was part of the presentation to the then Prime Minister, and there was a commitment made that those calls for justice were a priority. Our women were not going to be overlooked, but here we are. Now they're cutting the funding. What does that say to the families that are suffering? You know, if the core of those calls for justice aren't implemented, it doesn't change the reality that we live in. We're still being deemed less than anybody else in Canada. If this was happening on the same level as the women in Canada, if you take the percentage of our women that are going missing or been murdered and translate it into that, everybody would be in uproar. But because it's easy to overlook Indigenous women and the fact that we are in a genocide, the government is showing that their lack of will, their lack of responsibility to us is at the forefront. They rather fund a war than fund the war on our women here in Canada. And that is absolutely unacceptable. So when you ask what this funding cut will impact, it's going to impact the daily lives of every Indigenous woman, girl, 2S LGBTQIA plus living here in Canada. And is that acceptable to the Canadian population that they have a genocide going on here, but the government chooses to fund a war in a totally different country? Now, we have a lot of women sitting here. How would you feel if this was your loved ones, your family going through this, and you get this news? Is it acceptable? Absolutely not. So I'm hoping that the government hears what we're saying and comes back to the tables and starts funding what they're supposed to because they're not living up to their responsibility to those 231 calls to justice. 7 years is 7 years of the number of missing and murder going up and not being addressed properly. It's at a snail's pace, and that's not acceptable. Now,
I just wanted to add and affirm that Giganawenimaanaanig was given the responsibility to develop the Red Dress Alert. To date, the governments have not committed to funding the implementation of the Red Dress Alert. And we know that, the full range of prevention and support will cost Canada less than investigating homicides. So this, Canada needs to take another look and to move quickly. As I said, since we released our report in November, we have lost 5 women that have been recorded as having their lives violently taken from them.
So just going back to the cuts to Indigenous Services Canada and Crown Indigenous Relations, that's cuts to mental health services. Cuts to Jordan's Principle, for example, we know through the National Inquiry that child welfare is a pipeline to becoming murdered or disappeared. Cutbacks to housing. Cutbacks to families. Cutbacks, in fact, to residential school programs that were designed to support residential school survivors and their families. All of these impacts, all of these cutbacks combined place families at risk. And, I know that in my community, a lot of this funding goes to things like healing lodges, allowing people to go to ceremonies, providing funding for families when a loved one goes missing, to provide mental health supports and other supports needed for care. The government is callously cutting these kinds of services. Meanwhile, as we've said, they've found $13 billion to fund the war machine, and at the same time divested $7 billion from Indigenous peoples and put zero money into MMIWG. I can't think of anything more violent than saying your life is worth zero by this government. That is what normalized genocide looks like. That is what violence looks like. Thank you.
I just have one more question
I just wanted to add on to her. Yeah. So one of the things that governments don't consider is when there's project-based funding and families and survivors and Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people seek their supports. They build relationships, they connect to those programs and services, to maintain their well-being and access different types of supports. And when they're continuously sunsetting, they've had programs that have sunsetted for decades, in relation to government funding, it deeply impacts their spirits and increases their vulnerabilities because they no longer have access to those programs and supports with individuals that they've built relationships with, that they've invested trust in, and that they've, invested their well-being in. So it's very, very harmful, to have project-based funding that really supports family members and survivors, and as well as focusing on the prevention of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people. We've heard the Prime Minister talk about generational budgets, right? But we're not feeling it as Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people, because when you say generational to Indigenous people, that means something very powerful. We're looking out for the next 7 generations that are coming after us, and this is why the work we're doing today is so critical. So, my daughters and my granddaughters and my granddaughter's granddaughter will not have the same lived experiences I've had to have and my family has had to have. So this is why this work is so critical, and it focuses on upholding the human rights of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people. Thank you.
Yeah, I just have one question for all the women leading the 4 organizations today. Have any of you been able to have any contact with Minister Altley? Has she been able to reach out to any of you? Have you been able to get into direct contact with her about the funding needs?
So, considering that the National Family and Survivor Circle, along with my powerhouse Indigenous women who lead organizations, getting meetings with ministers has been very, very challenging. Since Minister Alti, I have a lot of respect for her. I've only had the ability to meet with her once.
We maybe have time for another question. Any more questions?
Just based on that, what do you think of her as a minister? Do you think she's doing her job properly? If you've only been able to get one meeting with her?
Well, I don't know, if she's doing her job properly. I'm, obviously trying to figure out what their mandate is and what their priorities are. And it's becoming quite evident that Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit and gender diverse people's lives are not their priority. So I'm still navigating that right now. Thank you.
Can I respond?
Yep.
So I think it's bigger than a minister. I think this is just a more related to systemic violence and systemic racism. And it's bigger than a minister. It's related to how ministries are working together, how the PMO is prioritizing what is a priority. It's very clear in the budget, we are not a priority. And I know that because we were given zero allocation of designated funding to address the ongoing genocide. That's bigger than a minister. That's related to finance and all the decisions that are being made. That was shocking to me. Zero. When they found $13 billion to fund, military. I'm not talking about improving the lives of veterans. I'm talking about providing funding to fuel a war machine. Meanwhile, even in my community of Winnipeg Centre, Indigenous women, girls, 2S LGBTQIA+, are in a war every day just to be safe. So I think it's bigger than a minister. Thank you.